I went camping with two friends to decompress after our final year of college. We were tired of city noise, obligations, and the constant pressure of exams and job searches. We wanted to disappear for a night, to a place that felt untouched, far from anyone who might interrupt. A local guidebook mentioned a remote lake in northern Maine, 3 miles off the nearest trail, accessible only by faint footpaths that most people overlooked. Sounded perfect. No cell reception, no other visitors, just dense forest and water. We packed light but thoroughly tense sleeping bags, basic food, water filters, a small first aid kit, flashlights, and extra batteries. We were young, confident, and convinced we could handle whatever the wilderness had to offer. We arrived at the trailhead in late afternoon, the sun leaning low behind the pines, casting long, slanted shadows across the dirt path. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and damp earth. We hiked in silence for the first hour, partly from exhaustion, partly from the unspoken excitement of leaving civilization behind. The trail narrowed, the trees pressing closer, and the ground grew uneven. Branches reached across our path, snapping underfoot or brushing our shoulders. By the second hour, the forest thickened, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in thin shafts that illuminated floating dust motes. The quiet was noticeable. Birds had mostly disappeared, and the occasional chipmunk or squirrel seemed startled into sudden silence by our presence. Every step felt heavier in that stillness, as though the forest itself was aware we were there. After nearly 3 miles, we found a small clearing where the trees fell back, revealing the lake. The surface was perfectly still, flat like glass, reflecting the deep green of the pines and the orange-pink fade of the late afternoon sky. There was no wind, no sound except the faint scuffle of our boots against the forest floor and the low drip of water from overhanging branches. It was breathtaking, almost unreal. We set up our tents along the edge of the clearing, careful to stay a safe distance from the water. The ground was soft but stable, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. We cleared brush, stacked firewood, and built a modest fire at the center. The smoke rose straight up, undisturbed, and the crackling flames cast long, flickering shadows across the trees. As night fell, the lake became darker, a smooth black mirror absorbing the last of the sunlight. The forest around us seemed to hold its breath. Normally, late August evenings in Maine are alive with the hum of insects and the occasional croak of frogs. But here there was nothing. The silence was almost tactile, pressing against the skin, filling ears with its absence. We ate a simple meal of rice and canned beans, cooked over the fire, and drank water straight from our filtered bottles. The air grew colder quickly once the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows lengthened and merged, folding into the black of the trees. I remember feeling a strange mix of awe and unease, a creeping awareness that something about the night was off, though I couldn't pinpoint what. A couple of hours after dark, one of my friends pointed toward the far side of the lake. I followed his gaze and noticed faint ripples crossing the surface, subtle at first, too uniform to be random. At first, I assumed wildlife, a beaver or an otter, but the movement didn't make sense. It was too regular, deliberate, like someone had pressed a hand to the water and dragged it across in a smooth line. My stomach tightened. We grabbed flashlights, sweeping beams across the lake, but there was nothing visible. No eyes, no wake that belonged to a known animal, nothing that could explain the rhythm of the ripples. It moved too smoothly, too consistently, skimming along the water without a splash. Every instinct screamed that we should leave, but we froze, watching the shadow stretch across the lake as if testing its own limits. The firelight flickered, shadows dancing unnaturally on the tree trunks behind us. Even the air seemed heavier, each breath colder and sharper, carrying a faint smell of wet pine and earth that suddenly felt alien. We slowly dismantled our tents, packing the sleeping bags and gear with deliberate care, trying not to make noise that might draw attention. Every footstep on the pine needle-carpeted ground sounded amplified, too loud in the stillness, echoing faintly across the lake. My hands shook slightly as I balanced our packs, the adrenaline thick in my veins. The path back seemed longer, denser, almost unfamiliar, as if the forest had shifted in the night. Shadows that had seemed stationary now moved at the corners of my vision. But when I turned, there was nothing. The forest made no sound except for our own careful movements, and yet I felt watched, as if the trees themselves were aware of every breath we drew. We didn't run, but we didn't walk comfortably either. We kept low, moving steadily and silently, glancing over shoulders and scanning the dark lake every few steps. The ripples never returned, yet the memory of them lingered, a pulse of unease we couldn't shake. Hours later, we reached the main trail, breathing easier but still tense. The forest here felt normal again, the typical night sounds of insects and distant calls restoring a sense of safety that had been absent by the lake. By the time we reached the edge of the parking area, the first light of dawn was beginning to streak the eastern sky. Exhausted, we drove back to the nearest town, the hum of the car engine and distant traffic feeling almost unbearably loud after the silence of the night. The next morning, curiosity and disbelief drove us back to the lake, this time by daylight. The 3-mile hike felt shorter in the light. When we arrived, the lake appeared entirely normal. The water was calm, reflecting the morning sky with no trace of the ripples or disturbance from the night before. Birds chirped, frogs croaked in the shallow edges, and a light breeze ruffled the surface, leaving gentle, uneven waves in contrast to the unnatural regularity of the previous night. We searched the shoreline, scanned the far side, and examined the water as best we could, but there was nothing. No tracks, no sign that anything had been there besides us. Still, the impression of the shadow on the water, and the absolute, deliberate silence that had blanketed the forest, lingered in our minds. It was enough to make us pack up and leave quickly, not out of fear of what we could see now, but out of respect for what had occurred when we weren't fully in control, when the forest had felt like its own entity with intentions we could not read. Looking back, I can't explain what we saw. No animal I know could produce such a pattern on the water, nor did the forest ever make a sound that night that fit with the natural rhythm of wildlife. But it didn't need to be explained to be real. The experience left a mark, a reminder of how quickly confidence can turn to vulnerability in isolation, how the world can feel entirely familiar one moment and completely alien the next. The lake returned to normal by morning, but we left with a clear understanding that the wilderness has its own awareness, that silence can be a choice, and that some things don't announce themselves in ways we can name or classify. We were not alone that night, and the forest had kept its silence deliberately, a quiet that neither threat nor creature could account for, leaving only memory and the unease of knowing that some spaces belong to forces beyond human perception. I was 17 and camping with my cousin near a seasonal creek at the edge of a burn scar. The fire had come through 3 summers earlier and left the hills stripped and pale, trunks blackened and fallen like scattered matchsticks. New growth clung low to the ground, manzanita and scrub oak pushing through ash that still stained the soil gray. We chose the site because the creek cut a shallow channel through the slope and held a thin ribbon of water even late in the season. It felt sheltered without being boxed in. The air smelled of dust and sap. The ground held warmth after sunset. We hiked in during the afternoon, packs light, confidence heavy. We were used to these places. Our families had camped in the foothills for years, and we knew the rules that kept you safe. Keep food tight, keep the fire small, listen at night. We set our tent above the creek on a flat bench where old roots made a low wall. We cleared stones and pitched fast. We ate before dark and put scraps away. The sun dropped behind the ridge and the heat bled out of the day. The burn scar cooled quicker than green forest. Sound carried far in that open slope. The creek whispered thin and constant, water sliding over stone. We lay back and watched the sky come on. Stars felt close. The moon rose late. When it did, it painted the dead trunks white and left the spaces between them black. The place looked bigger at night, less forgiving. Wind moved across the slope and rattled the scrub. We crawled into the tent and zipped it to keep bugs out. The nylon held the day's warmth for a while. We talked low until sleep took us. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of breath that did not match mine. It came from close, just outside the tent, quick and shallow, pushed through a nose. At first I thought it was my cousin shifting. Then the shape of the sound made me still. The creek kept its pace. Wind paused. The breathing stayed. I listened hard and felt my pulse lift into my throat. I waited for steps, for the scrape of shoes or the crunch of gravel. None came. The breathing grew louder, then softer, like someone leaning in and pulling back. The zipper tugged once, a small test, then stopped. The tent wall bowed in a fraction. I smelled sweat and smoke, old and sour, layered with dust. My cousin stirred beside me. I held my breath and counted heartbeats. The nylon brushed my shoulder as weight shifted outside. Then the zipper slid down in one smooth pull. Moonlight spilled through the opening. A man stood there, barefoot on cold ground. His skin was burned dark from the sun, not tanned but cooked, cracked in places like old leather. His hair hung in uneven clumps, stiff with dirt. His eyes did not settle on anything. They moved past us, then back, unfocused, pupils wide. He did not speak. He did not blink much. He stood too close, inside the space where a body expects air. He breathed fast through his nose, flaring it, chest pumping. I could see the rise and fall under a thin shirt that hung wrong on him, stretched and torn at the seams. His feet were thick and pale at the edges, callous deep with cracks that caught dirt. No pack, no shoes, no light. His hands hung open at his sides, fingers spread, nails chewed short and rimmed black. Time slowed into pieces. I noticed the way ash dusted his ankles. I noticed the way his calves were scarred, old burns and scratches layered over each other. I noticed how still he held his shoulders, how the only motion came from breath. The tent felt small, the air gone. I could hear my cousin's breathing turn quick. The man leaned in a little, head tilting, as if listening to something we could not hear. When my cousin reached for the flashlight, the beam clicked on by accident, washing the tent wall with white and throwing the man's shadow tall and broken against the burned trunks. The light caught his face and he flinched, a sharp recoil like a struck animal. He bolted then, no hesitation, spinning and launching uphill into the brush. The slope above us was steep, loose with ash and stone, cut by old fire lines and gullies. No one should have been able to climb it fast in the dark, barefoot. He did not slow. He moved on all fours for a few steps, then upright again, hands grabbing at scrub, feet finding purchase where there should have been none. Branches snapped. Stones rattled. The sound went up and away, not down, not sideways. Then it stopped. We sat frozen, light shaking, the beam slicing across trunks and empty space. Nothing moved. The creek kept whispering. Wind returned. My ears rang with the sudden absence of him. I waited for laughter, for some sign this was a mistake. None came. We stayed awake until gray touched the ridge. We did not leave the tent. When the light grew enough to see, we stepped out together. The ground outside was scuffed with bare prints pressed deep into ash, toes splayed wide. The prints angled uphill and vanished where the slope broke. The tent zipper hung open. Our packs were untouched. Food was untouched. It was as if he had come only to look. We packed in silence. The hike out felt longer than the hike in. Every sound behind us pulled our heads around. We saw no one. At the trailhead, a ranger truck sat parked in the shade. We waited until the ranger returned and reported what happened. The ranger listened without interrupting, eyes steady, hands resting on the hood. Later, after we got home, my aunt called to say the ranger had followed up. There were people living feral in burn zones, avoiding detection, moving camp to camp as the land allowed. They scavenged old fire roads and seasonal creeks. They slept in culverts and under fallen trunks. They avoided trails and lights. Some had been out there for years. Bare feet made sense. The speed made sense. The silence made sense. He had likely smelled our fire and followed the creek. He had likely meant to check if we were asleep, to see if there was food worth taking. When the light hit him, instinct took over and he fled the way he always fled, uphill into ground he knew. Knowing it was human did not make it better. It made it worse. A person choosing to live that way learns the land in a way visitors never do. They learn how sound carries. They learn which slopes hold and which slide. They learn how close they can get without being heard. The burn scar that felt empty to us was a map to him, every snag and wash a marker. The thought that he had stood there breathing our air, close enough to touch, and then vanished into a place we could not follow stayed with me. I went back to that area years later in daylight with friends and permits and radios. The creek still ran thin in summer. New trees stood knee-high in places. The slope above our old site was still steep. I tried to imagine climbing it barefoot in the dark and failed. The land had not changed enough to soften what happened. The explanation fit, clean and complete, and it did nothing to loosen the memory. The truth was simple. We had crossed paths with someone who lived outside the thin safety of shared rules, and for a few minutes, in a quiet place burned raw by fire, the distance between our worlds closed. I went up the mountain alone one late summer, carrying a light pack and enough food for 2 nights. I had planned it carefully. The trailhead was far from the main road, and the route took me through a series of ridges that looked empty on the map but held dense scrub and rocky outcrops. The air was dry and thin, carrying the faint smell of pine resin mixed with dust from the old fire scars scattered on the lower slopes. I chose a campsite on a narrow shoulder above a steep drop, a small bench of soil and rock where I could see the valley spread below in a mosaic of forest and burned clearings. The hike up took longer than I expected. The trail was faint in places, overgrown and littered with fallen branches. Loose stones rolled under my boots, forcing careful steps, and the steepness of the upper slopes made every step deliberate. The sun dropped low by the time I reached the site. Light bent over the ridges, painting the rocks a deep orange, and shadows stretched long across the benches. I set the tent on a flat spot just wide enough for the footprint, dug a shallow trench to divert water in case of rain, and stacked rocks around it. I kept my food in a bare canister and wedged it under a large boulder for security. The wind swept along the ridges, carrying a sharp chill, and I felt the first real awareness of how exposed the place was. As darkness fell, the air cooled fast. I lit a small stove and boiled water, taking care to keep the flame low against the gusts. The valley below grew a flat, dark green as the sun disappeared. I ate slowly, tasting the dust and pine in every bite. Once the stove was packed, I zipped into my sleeping bag inside the tent, leaving the vestibule empty except for my pack and boots. The wind rattled the tent fabric, and distant rocks slid down slopes with occasional clatter, sounds magnified by the open space. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that immediately set me on edge. It was not wind or rockfall. It was a footstep, deliberate, not hurried, somewhere along the ridge above the camp. I held still, heart hammering, listening. A single step, then another. Not a shuffle, not a stumble. Someone or something was moving carefully, climbing the rocks above me. The slope there was loose and jagged. Any hiker would struggle to move silently, yet the steps came light but precise. I stayed in the tent, eyes wide in the darkness. I could hear the faint scrape of boots or bare feet against stone, a deliberate path weaving along the ridge. The wind carried the sound in bursts, masking it and then letting it through in clear lines. Time stretched, every second sharpened. I knew the ridge above was the only route someone could take, but there were no markings on the trail. No tracks, no flashlights, only sound. After what felt like hours, the steps paused. The wind shifted, and I could hear shallow breathing, too steady and human to be an animal, but too far to identify. The ridge held no trees. Any figure would be exposed. I watched the tent fabric ripple in the draft, knowing it could not hide me, yet feeling the impulse to stay completely still. The wind carried a faint smell of sweat and dust, a human smell that pricked my senses. Eventually, the noise receded. The steps moved away along the ridge, then downhill toward a lower bench, over rocks that echoed under careful feet. The night grew colder. I shivered, zipped the sleeping bag tighter, and tried to sleep again, hearing only the wind and occasional stonefall. But the awareness of movement, human and precise, lingered like a weight on my chest. Morning light came thin and gray. I unzipped the tent and stepped out onto the soil bench. The slope was quiet and empty. The valley spread below in layers of mist and green. I scanned the ridge above, searching for footprints, broken branches, anything that might explain the sound. There was nothing. The rocks were untouched. Small shrubs bent under the wind, not hands. I packed the tent quickly and began the hike down. Every footstep I took echoed off stone. I checked the ridge repeatedly, half expecting to see a figure moving with the contours, tracking me. Nothing appeared. By mid-morning, I had reached a safer slope where the trees grew thick and the underbrush was solid. I found small signs, broken branches, flattened grass, faint scuffs in soil, that suggested someone had passed in the night, but they were inconsistent, scattered, enough to confirm human presence without giving identity. Later, when I returned to the trailhead and reported the experience to park rangers, they explained that the mountain had a history of transient hikers and occasional squatters. Some moved into abandoned cabins, burned zones, and steep ridges to avoid detection. They traveled at night, climbing difficult terrain that most would not attempt. Knowing the footsteps were human did not relieve the tension. It emphasized the skill and awareness of whoever had been there. Someone had been out there, observing, moving quietly over impossible ground, and had passed within feet of my camp. The climb back down was slower. My mind replayed every sound, every shadow. The ridge looked calm in daylight, almost innocuous, but memory held the deliberate steps, the rhythm of a body moving on uneven stone with precision. The realization settled in: mountains are open, exposed, and silent, but human presence can still exist in ways that bend perception. The weight of that knowledge pressed with the same density as a storm, even in clear light. By the time I reached my vehicle, the heat of the valley had returned, and the mountain behind me looked like any other: gray rock and green trees. The trailhead was quiet, safe, and mundane. I drove away slowly, glancing back at the slope, understanding that the mountain would hold that night, those steps, that presence, and it would never reveal more. The certainty of human skill and human patience left a lingering unease, a recognition that the wilderness is not only shaped by nature, but by those who have learned to move within it unseen. I went out there because my dad had died earlier that year, and hiking was the only thing that quieted my head. Grief had a way of stacking itself in my chest until even breathing felt like work. Walking until my legs burned was the only thing that thinned it out. I picked a dispersed site off an old logging spur I found on a paper map, one of those faint lines that barely counted as a road anymore. It sat far enough from the main trail that I didn't expect anyone. That mattered. I wanted to be alone without having to work for it. The drive took most of the afternoon. The road narrowed from pavement to gravel, then to dirt, then to a pair of ruts cut through grass. Alder brushed the sides of my truck. The radio cut in and out. I parked where the spur dipped into a stand of fir and spruce and walked the last half mile with my pack. The air had that damp, green smell that sticks to your clothes. It felt like a place that hadn't changed much in decades. The site looked right at first, flat enough for a tent, close to water but not too close. No fire ring, which I liked. The ground, though, felt wrong when I stepped off the spur. Too soft in long strips, like something heavy had paced the same line for years. My boots sank an inch, sometimes two, then hit firmer soil. The soft parts ran parallel, not random, pressed into the duff and needles as if repeated weight had trained the earth to give there. I told myself it was old skidder tracks filled in with rot. Logging had been rough in this area a long time ago. I dropped my pack and walked the perimeter, doing the quiet checks I always did. Widowmakers overhead, ant hills, game trails. The trees caught my eye. Several trunks were scarred at shoulder height, bark rubbed smooth. Not cut, not clawed. The wood underneath had darkened with age. Some had sap dried into amber lines. The scars wrapped around the trunks in arcs, not straight across, like something had leaned and shifted against them. Elk rubbed trees, but these marks were higher than I expected and wider than antlers usually left. I thought about bears. Bears scratch and rub, but these spots were too consistent, too clean. I shrugged it off. Forests hold more stories than explanations. I set my tent where the ground felt firmer and cooked a simple meal as the light dropped. The sky thinned from blue to gray to the color of wet slate. Birds settled. Insects took over. The creek made a steady sound I could tune my breathing to. I sat on a log and ate until the food tasted like nothing. The quiet did what I hoped it would. My head loosened. The weight eased. I thought about my dad without the sharp edge. I packed my food away and hung it out of habit, even though I planned to leave early. By the time I crawled into the tent, the forest had settled into its night shape. I checked my watch. 9:40 p.m. I lay on my back and stared at the mesh, counting breaths. That was when I heard it. Slow breathing that didn't match my own. It wasn't close enough to feel, but it was near enough to recognize. In through the nose, out through the mouth, measured and heavy. It moved with the wind but wasn't wind. When the breeze lifted, the sound slid through the trees with it. When the air went still, the breathing stayed. I held my breath to be sure. The sound continued. I sat up and listened. It wasn't an animal pant. It didn't have the ragged edge of exertion or the quick pace of alertness. It had patience. It had weight. I could place it somewhere beyond the tent, maybe 30 yards, maybe more. Distance is hard at night. Sound bends. I told myself it was someone else camped farther in, maybe asleep and breathing loud. The spur was old, but it wasn't secret. The breathing drifted left, then right, always circling, never approaching. I heard needles compress, not a snap, just a press and release. Something heavy shifting its weight. The ground outside was soft in those long strips. I thought about that. I thought about the rub trees. My chest tightened. I reached for my headlamp and turned it on, then off. Light would only make me visible. I lay still and listened until my jaw ached from clenching. Time stretched. The forest didn't erupt. Nothing rushed the tent. The breathing kept its pace, unbothered by my presence, or aware of it in a way that didn't require urgency. At some point, fatigue took over. I slept in shallow waves, waking each time the sound passed behind my head or moved farther out. Near dawn, it faded, not all at once, but like someone walking away while keeping the same rhythm. I woke to gray light and cold air. My watch read just after 6. I didn't move at first. I listened. The forest had reset itself. Birds called. The creek spoke. No breathing. I got dressed fast and stepped out. The ground around the tent showed the same soft strips I'd noticed before, but now I could see where they deepened near the trees. I followed them with my eyes, careful not to step on them, tracing a loop around my camp. Near the firs, I found tracks. Bare feet, but wider, toes splayed, sunk deeper on one side like the weight shifted sideways when it walked. The heel impression was long. The arch barely lifted. The soil held the shape cleanly. No shoe pattern. No claw. The prints overlapped in places, paced into the same path until the ground had learned them. They led past the rubbed trunks and back into the darker timber, then disappeared where the ground turned rocky. I squatted and studied them until my knees hurt. I didn't take photos. I didn't want to frame it, didn't want a record that would pull me into explanations I didn't need. I knew what I saw. It was something that walked like a person and weighed more than me and spent enough time here to wear the trees smooth. It breathed slow at night and kept its distance. That was enough. I broke camp without eating. I moved with purpose, not panic, keeping my senses open. Nothing followed. The forest stayed ordinary. When I reached my truck, my hands shook as I stowed my pack. I sat with the door open and let the quiet drain away. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. The radio came back. The road widened. The weight returned, but it was different now. It had edges again. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report that would land where it needed to. I didn't go back to that spur. I didn't camp alone again after that trip. Hiking still quieted my head, but I kept to daylight and shared miles. Grief asks for space, but the woods keep their own. I was 23 and doing a solo overnighter while scouting land for a geology internship. The site sat far from pavement, a wide, high desert bench where old lava had cooled into broken basalt and thin soils. There were no trees. Sage covered the flats in low gray clumps, spaced far enough apart that wind ran straight through them. Sound traveled too far out there. Every scrape or thump went on longer than it should, bouncing off rock and coming back thin and late. I parked my truck near a dry wash because it blocked the wind. The wash cut a shallow curve through the bench, its bank steep enough to break the gusts and hold some heat. I pitched nothing. I slept in a bivvy with my pack as a pillow and my boots inside the hood to keep scorpions out. I spent the afternoon mapping contacts and taking notes, moving slow to avoid rolling an ankle on the basalt plates. The ground smelled clean and dusty. The sky stayed clear, the sun hard and white. I finished as the light went flat and the colors drained from the land. I ate cold food, checked my headlamp, and walked the short line from the bivvy to the truck to make sure I could find it in the dark. The wash lay to my left, a ribbon of darker soil and shadow. The open space beyond it felt wider once the light fell. I could see far, but there was nothing to look at. When the wind dropped, the quiet pressed in. In places like that, quiet is not silence. It is a thin skin. I lay on my back and watched stars come on one by one. The air cooled fast. Sage gave off a dry smell. I pulled the bivvy tight and listened to my own breath until it settled. The first sound did not register as movement. It was a long scrape that had no clear start or end, like something being dragged along packed dirt. Came from the wash. I waited for footsteps to follow, but none came. The sound moved in a slow arc, steady, unbroken, then faded. After a long pause, it came again from the other side, the same scrape, the same speed. It did not hurry. It did not stop. It made a continuous contact with the ground, a stiff thing being pulled along, not lifted. I counted seconds without meaning to. The time between passes stayed the same. I stayed in the bivvy. I did not sit up. In open space, movement draws attention. I kept my head still and my eyes open. The stars looked sharp. The scrape came again. I tried to place it against what I knew. Coyotes run and stop. Deer step light. Cattle clop and breathe loud. This was none of that. This was a single line of sound, flat and patient, making a circle that fit the wash. It never crossed into the open. It never came closer than the bank. It never left. After several passes, smell arrived ahead of sound. Came in a wave that made my throat tighten. It smelled like hot iron and rot. Blood warmed by sun smells like that. So does old meat left too long. The smell rolled low and stayed close to the ground. It was strongest when the scrape was nearest, then thinned as it moved on. My pulse felt loud. I kept counting seconds. I kept my hands flat on my chest so they would not shake against fabric. I thought of injuries. I thought of wire and bone. Old farms had once pushed fences out here and left posts where they fell. I pictured an animal caught up in something long, dragging it in a circle because straight lines hurt. I pictured hooves and antlers and a body that could not turn well. The smell fit that. The sound fit that. The circling fit that. The choice of the wash fit that. The bank would hide a body and hold a path. Time stretched. The scrape went on and on. At some point my eyes burned and my neck ached. I shifted a finger and froze again. Nothing changed. The smell grew stronger once, close enough to taste, then eased. The scrape slowed for a few passes, then returned to its steady pace. It never rushed. It never tested me. That bothered me. A curious animal would come close. A hungry one would cut across. This kept its route. Near the darkest part of the night, the sound moved farther out. The circle widened. The smell thinned. I waited for it to leave. It did not. Kept its rhythm. I kept counting. The numbers lost meaning and became a beat I held on to. When light began to thin the dark, the scrape faded for good. The smell lifted with the cold. I waited until the sky went gray. I listened hard. Nothing moved. I sat up slow and unzipped the bivvy. The land looked flat and empty again. My truck sat where I left it, a dark block against pale ground. I walked the wash first. The dirt showed a clean track, a single line pressed into the bank, scuffed smooth by something dragged over and over. There were hoof prints in places where the bank had crumbled, large and deep, splayed wide. In the soft spots I saw hair, coarse and dark, snagged on thorns. I found a length of rusted fence wire bent into a long hook, ends polished bright where they had rubbed rock. The wire smelled like iron. A few yards away lay a broken T-post, heavy and stiff, its end worn flat. Blood spotted the dirt in old dark drops and newer wet smears. The smell hung low and strong there. I followed the drag mark away from the wash toward my truck. Curved past the rear tire. I stopped when I saw the sidewall. The rubber had been peeled back in a wide flap, not cut, not slashed. Teeth marks showed in the edge, shallow and broad, spaced far apart. The flap still clung by cords. Mud and hair stuck to it. The truck itself bore a smear of dark red on the bumper. Whatever had passed had been close enough to touch metal and had done so. It had chosen the tire, not me. That choice sat heavy in my chest. I found more tracks beyond, leading toward a low ridge. The drag line ended where the ground turned hard. The hoof prints staggered. The wire lay twisted and bloodied near a rock. There were antler marks scored into the stone, fresh and pale. The pattern made sense then. A bull elk had tangled a length of old fence wire in its antlers, hooked a fallen post, and dragged it. The post made the scrape. The wire cut and tore, heating as it rubbed. The animal had circled the wash because turning tight hurt less and the bank hid the drag. The smell came from fresh wounds and the heat held in the wash at night. The tire had smelled like salt and rubber and oil. The elk had mouthed it in pain or confusion, peeled it with its teeth, then moved on. I did not feel relief. I felt a cold respect. An injured animal with strength left is not safe, even if it keeps its distance. I packed fast. I did not linger. I drove out on a flat, ruined tire, slow and steady, watching the open ground. Later, daylight full, I reported what I found to land managers. They cleared the wire and tracked the animal. Weeks after, I learned the bull had been found and put down due to infection and damage. That fit the smell and the blood and the patience of the circle. What stayed with me was not the danger I avoided. It was the restraint. In that wide place with sound that carried too far, something had moved close enough to touch my truck and had chosen a quieter path. It had kept to its pain and its circle and left me alone. In open land, that choice carries weight. Lockdown had just lifted, and we wanted space, silence, and distance from the empty streets and cramped apartments. Four of us drove until the houses thinned and the roads became gravel, eventually finding a clearing that sloped gently toward a stand of pine. The campsite was isolated, hidden along the edge of old mining pits that were mostly overgrown, the entrances swallowed by brush and small trees. We set up late in the afternoon, the sun low, spilling a weak, orange light across the uneven snow-dusted ground. I carried the heaviest pack, but it felt lighter than it should have, like relief made me careless. The air was cold and dry, rasping in my throat, and the smell of the forest after winter was faint but sharp. Pine and wet earth mingled with old smoke from previous campers. One of us, tired from the drive, fell asleep almost immediately, curling up in his sleeping bag without a word. The rest of us wandered a little, inspecting the overgrown pits, careful to avoid loose stones and brittle roots. The forest was unervingly quiet, the kind of quiet where small sounds seemed louder than they should. Birds were scarce, only the occasional crow's call echoing off the slopes, and even that felt delayed, as if the sound was reluctant to travel. We returned to the fire we'd built and tried to settle in, joking to break the tension, our laughter bouncing briefly across the hollow spaces that the old mines had left behind. Started near midnight. At first, I thought it was my friend snoring. The rhythm was off, stuttering and uneven, with long pauses that didn't match his steady exhalations. Came from the woods, not the tent. We froze, listening, and a nervous laugh ran through the group. The sound repeated, louder this time, closer, mimicking the snore exactly but out of sync in subtle ways. We tried holding our breath to see if it would stop, and it did momentarily, but when we exhaled, it resumed immediately, matching our breathing pattern in real time, pausing when we paused, sighing when we exhaled. The logical part of my mind wanted to laugh it off as an animal, a coyote maybe, or an echo from the mine shafts, but it was too precise. The The sound moved toward the edge of the clearing, staying just beyond the weak circle of firelight. There were no footfalls, no snapping twigs, no rustling of brush. Just the echo of the snore, closer and closer, until it felt like the space between the fire and the trees was shrinking. My heart beat against my ribs, loud and uneven, and I noticed the other two watching me, faces pale in the flickering light. None of us spoke. The snore lingered until it paused abruptly, then faded into the distance. I realized I had been gripping my knife, feeling foolish, but unable to release it. Sleep was impossible after that. Morning came slow. The sun filtered through low clouds, casting dull light across the snow and mud. We ventured toward the nearest pit, where the snow was thin and the brush had been disturbed. Fresh scrape marks led from the brush to the edge of the pit, irregular and deep, as if something heavy had dragged itself out. The impressions continued down into the pit, shallow at first, then disappearing into darkness. There was no other trace of what had made them. No footprints leading to or from the pit beyond the scratches. No broken branches, no displaced rocks. It was as though whatever had emerged had done so with extreme care, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid leaving anything but the marks in the snow and mud. The fire from the night before had burned down to ash, leaving a faint smoky scent in the cold morning air. We examined the pit carefully. The brush was bent outward, crushed under unseen weight. I realized then how precarious our position had been. The slope was subtle, but if someone or something had fallen from that pit in the dark, the fall would have been serious. The scrape marks suggested intent, a movement with direction. It wasn't playful, it wasn't accidental. Whatever had been there had come out, lingered, and returned without trace. The rest of the day felt strange, the forest quieter than before, as if it had taken a breath and was holding it. Every sound, the wind through pine needles, the faint drip of melting snow, was amplified in my awareness. We packed up, leaving some of our supplies behind, unwilling to linger near the pits longer than necessary. Even as we walked back to the car, the feeling of being watched didn't fade, though there were no further noises. My friends and I avoided speaking about it. The memory of the snore, precise and patient, stayed with us, and none of us wanted to acknowledge it aloud. By the time we reached the road, the scrape marks were behind us, the clearing empty and still. The isolation that had seemed freeing the day before now felt oppressive in retrospect. The silence of the mines more than just quiet. It felt like attention, deliberate and watchful. I realized that what had unsettled me was not the immediate threat, but the patient observation, the ability to move without detection. It wasn't supernatural. It didn't need to be. It was human, or at least human-like, and that was enough to make the forest feel dangerous in a way that no storm or animal could replicate. We drove away, the car bumping over gravel and snow, and the world of roads, houses, and other people felt immediately safer. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see the pits again, the bends in the brush, the subtle depressions in the snow that suggested unseen movement, the memory of the sound, the imitation of our friends snoring, the way it had mirrored us, remained vivid, a quiet, impossible echo. It made me think differently about the wilderness, about the places we assume are empty. Some spaces, even when abandoned by humans, still retain a presence, and the patience of that presence can be measured in sound, in movement, in the careful ways a being can navigate the dark without ever showing itself. We never returned to that campsite. The scrape marks, the echoing snore, and the bent brush lingered in my mind longer than any fear of injury or storm. I understood then that the forest had its own logic independent of ours. We had been unobservant, temporarily safe only because the night concealed us, and the day revealed the traces of something deliberate. Survival, in the woods, is not always about fire or food. Sometimes it is about noticing the small, quiet signals, the signs of movement that belong to a world we cannot fully enter. And that morning, standing on the edge of the pit, I understood that leaving was the only way to respect that truth and to survive it. I went with my older brother because he insisted on one last trip before getting married. He wanted something quiet and out of the way, a place that felt earned. We chose a remote lake reached by a long paddle and a narrow cut through reeds. A lake with no portage traffic and no cabins. The map showed deep water close to shore and a basin shaped like a bowl. Locals at the outfitter had mentioned loons nesting there every year. That mattered to my brother. He liked signs that a place stayed the same. The day we went in was still and clear. The lake opened up after the channel like a sheet of dark glass. Pines ringed the shore, tall and thin, their reflections stacked straight down into the water. We set camp on a small rock point that gave us a view across the widest part of the lake. The ground was bare granite with shallow pockets of soil where moss held. We tied the canoe high and set the food barrel back in the trees, wedged between roots. Everything felt clean and settled. The loons called through the afternoon, long wavering notes that carried across the water. Their calls stitched the hours together. I cleaned fish and watched the ripples fade. The sun slid down and the light went flat. We ate and put things away. The loons called again as the sky went purple, then went quiet. I noticed it because the quiet felt too sudden, like a switch thrown. I had heard loons go silent in storms, but the air stayed calm. The lake held a perfect mirror. The woods pressed close. As night came on, sound traveled in odd ways. A splash sounded from the far shore, heavy like someone wading through weeds. I watched the water and saw nothing move. No rings, no slosh, no wake. The surface stayed smooth. A few minutes later the splash came again, closer, then nothing. I listened hard. Frogs had stopped. The loons stayed silent. The only sound left was the faint creak of trees cooling. I lay in my bag and tried to place the splashing against animals I knew. Beavers slapped tails and left rings. Otters rolled and chattered. Deer stepped light and broke the surface. This was a steady entry sound without the follow-through. It repeated twice more and stopped. I fell asleep late, waking once to the sense that something moved along the shore, then slept again. Morning came gray and cool. I went to check the food barrel first. The lid sat on. The straps were tight. The sides were crushed inward, not torn, not chewed. The plastic bowed in with round dents, evenly spaced, pressed from all sides at once. Each dent was smooth and shallow, the size of a thumb pad. They formed a ring around the barrel at chest height. The barrel had been held and squeezed. The lid showed the same pattern, a circle of impressions like hands testing the seal. I stood there a long time. I knew bear sign. Bears ripped and chewed. They clawed and tore. They did not press evenly. They did not leave clean circles. I felt cold even as the sun lifted. When my brother came over, he stopped smiling. He looked from the barrel to the water and back again. He stopped making light of it then. He stayed quiet and went to the shore. The lake lay flat. Mist hugged the far bank. As the light strengthened, shapes came up in the reflection. Pines stacked deep. The sky brightened. Near the center of the lake, where the map showed the deepest water, a tall shape stood in the reflection. It rose straight up from the mirrored trees, long and dark. It did not ripple. It did not move with the breeze. It looked like a person standing upright, shoulders squared, head above the rest, feet planted where there should have been nothing to stand on. The actual water held no shape. Only the reflection showed it. My brother froze. He stared until the light shifted and the shape broke into lines. Then it was gone. He turned away and busied himself with gear. He would not look back. He would not describe what he saw. He only said later that it stood where the water should have been deep. He never added more. We packed faster than planned. As we worked, I found tracks in the mud along the inlet. They were large and split, pressed deep, with long scuffs between steps. Willow stems nearby were stripped and broken at a height above my head. The bark showed wet tears and saliva marks. In the shallows, weeds were churned and bent. The splashing from the night before made sense then. A moose had been feeding, wading chest deep, stepping slow and heavy. Moose stand in deep water to reach plants. From a distance at dawn, a moose reflected in still water can look upright, taller than it is, its legs hidden by glare, its body stretched by the mirror. The barrel made sense too. Moose are curious and strong. They mouth things. They press with muzzles and lips, broad and blunt. A moose can wrap its mouth around an object and test it, pressing from different angles. The round dents matched the shape of a soft muzzle pushing hard. The height matched a moose standing close, chest against the barrel, lips working the sides. No teeth marks because there were no teeth involved. Just pressure. The loons stopping made sense. Moose moving through a small lake at night will clear birds. The silence fit. The flat water fit the lack of ripples if the animal moved slow and steady. The sound without rings fit weight entering and leaving with care. Everything fit once I let it. We left without fishing. The paddle out felt longer. I kept looking back at the lake. The surface stayed calm. Nothing followed. On the drive home, my brother stayed quiet. Weeks later, when I laid out the explanation in full, he listened and nodded. He accepted it. He still will not talk about the reflection. I think he saw the same thing I did, stretched by light and fear into something else. In a place that quiet, the mind fills gaps fast. What bothered me was not that a moose had come so close. It was how easily a familiar shape had turned into something wrong when the lake went still and the birds went quiet. I had been planning this trip for weeks, a solo winter survival exercise to test myself against cold, isolation, and the unexpected. The snow was just beginning to crust over, a thin, brittle layer that crackled underfoot, and the sky hung low with gray light that promised heavier snowfall soon. I followed a faint snowmobile trail I'd spotted on old maps, an abandoned spur that led deeper into the forest than I usually went. It was quiet in a way that settled into your chest, not the empty silence of a city at night, but the weight of a place where the world hadn't been disturbed in years. Every step I took sank slightly into snow, sometimes powdery, sometimes frozen stiff beneath a thin sheet of ice. The clearing was unexpected. It opened like a window between the trees, a flat stretch of hard-packed snow surrounded by evergreens. The first thing I noticed was how the trees leaned in, their trunks bending toward the center as if they'd grown around something that had long since vanished. There were no signs of recent human presence, no discarded items, nothing that could explain why it felt deliberately used. Still, the sense of expectation in the air was heavy, the snow bearing a subtle unevenness, faint impressions that were almost too uniform to be natural. I shook it off as imagination and began setting up my camp. I built a small platform for my stove and cleared a space for my sleeping bag. The wind whispered through the bent pines, carrying the sharp scent of frozen resin. The first night passed without incident. I kept my headlamp close, ran through the survival drills I had planned, and tried to ignore the creeping thought that the forest was too still. The second night, it started. At exactly 1:12 a.m., I woke to the sound of 3 heavy steps. Not a shuffle or a scuff, but distinct, deliberate, and measured. I froze, listening for more, waiting for the crunch to continue or fade into distance. There was nothing, no approach, no retreat, just the echoing impact of those 3 steps on the crusted snow around my tent. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer stepping on frozen branches, but the timing, the exact rhythm, felt impossible to explain. I slept in short bursts after that, waking before midnight, straining to catch any sign of movement. The clearing felt smaller, more enclosed than it had in daylight. The trees seemed closer, the shadows denser, and the snow under the platform I had cleared retained a faint depression where something heavy had pressed. Each night, without fail, the steps returned at 1:12. Always 3, always nothing else. My confidence in my preparation began to erode. My eyes scanned the treeline constantly. My hand rested near my knife, though I knew it wouldn't matter if whatever it was decided to step into the clearing. On the 3rd morning, I went to inspect my footprint trail from the previous day, checking my navigation markers and clearing snow for better visibility. That's when I saw them. My own boot prints, which I had meticulously made along the snowmobile trail, had been stepped into. The stride was identical to mine, the alignment exact, but the impressions were deeper, wider, and notably barefoot. The snow had compacted in a way that no boot could replicate, with a heft and pressure I didn't have in my own step. My stomach dropped, and a tight, cold dread climbed from my spine to the base of my skull. I followed the prints back toward my camp, confirming what I already feared. They had circled the tent, perfectly tracing my movements. Every point of contact had the weight of a body, but no one had been there. I packed quickly, leaving the stove, my food, the carefully stacked firewood. I left everything, knowing I had no use for it if the forest itself was shadowing me. The snowmobile trail offered the faintest guidance, and I moved fast, boots crunching through the crusted snow, eyes darting to the leaning trees that seemed almost alive in the dim light. The steps didn't return immediately, but I imagined them behind me, catching my pace, echoing the rhythm I had come to dread. My lungs burned, my thighs ached, but fear sharpened every sense. The sky was still gray, but I could sense the clouds thickening, a soft drizzle of snow beginning as if the world itself was observing my escape. Hours passed, and eventually, the trail opened into a main logging road, packed hard by trucks long abandoned, a flat expanse where human-made edges met the forest's edge. The steps never returned, and the sense of being followed slowly began to loosen. By the time I reached my vehicle, parked a mile down the road, the snow had gathered into small drifts, whispering quietly under the wind. I sat for a long while, shivering, hands wrapped around a thermos of coffee I had left in the car, looking back into the darkening forest. The clearing, the bent trees, the barefoot prints. It all made a stark impression, one I knew would linger in the memory longer than any simple survival exercise ever could. I never went back to that trail. I told myself the steps were some undiscovered animal, a large predator testing territory, or some other natural explanation. But the precision, the imitation of my own stride, stayed with me. I realized then that in the wilderness, control is always an illusion, and sometimes preparation can only take you so far. The forest had tested me, in its quiet, unyielding way, and I had survived not because I was strong, but because I had recognized the limits of what I could confront. The clearing, the bent trees, the steps, they remained a reminder that some places demand respect beyond maps, equipment, and skill. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back, and the certainty that no amount of training could prepare for the unknowable patience of the wilderness. I had been returning to that bend in the river for years, a narrow curve where the water slowed, deepening enough to hold trout and still allowing room to cast without tangling in overhanging willows. Spring had always been predictable there. The air carried the sharp, wet scent of thawing soil, the river water cold and clear, and the elk grazed near the banks in the mornings, unaware or unconcerned by my presence. That year something was off. The usual tracks in the mud were absent, the forest quieter, almost too quiet. I noticed it while setting up camp on the small flat just above the riverbank. The tall grass flattened irregularly, but not in a pattern I could place at first. There were no elk, no deer, not even the smaller animals I expected to see, and the silence carried weight. I pitched my tent in the usual spot, a small clearing where the grass grew thick and the soil drained well. The river burbled steadily below, and the sky had that washed-out gray light of early spring, clouds low and heavy. I fished through the afternoon, taking my time, letting the sun warm my back while the water pulled at my line. By evening, I had caught enough for a meal and a modest supply of fillets to dry for later. The night came cold, the wind slipping through the pines with a low, steady whistle. I had slept here hundreds of times and knew every sound, the rush of water over stones, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant call of birds waking early. None of it had felt threatening. None of it had felt wrong. I woke just after midnight to a subtle vibration through the tent floor. At first, I thought it was the river, the wind, or my own nerves, but it continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like a body leaning against the tent and shifting weight slowly from one side to the other. It wasn't concentrated on a single point. There were no dents or depressions, just a gentle, even pressure. My heart started to hammer against my chest. I rolled over and pressed my hand against the nylon, expecting to feel the warmth of a hiker or animal, but there was nothing. I froze, listening. The vibration persisted, soft, unrelenting, as if the ground itself were moving against me. I burst from the tent, shouting into the darkness, adrenaline sharp in my ears. The river whispered below. The forest stood empty, and the moonlight scattered weakly across the clearing. There was nothing, no one, no footprints, no movement, nothing that could explain what I had felt. My gaze swept the area around the tent, and that's when I noticed the grass. It was pressed flat in a perfect oval around the tent, all blades bent in the same direction, radiating outward in a way that suggested deliberate contact. The imprint was subtle, the flattened blades reflecting the moonlight differently than the untouched grass, but unmistakable. My hands shook as I took it in. Nothing had stepped near the tent, yet everything around it had been laid down in a meticulous pattern, consistent and complete. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my sleeping pad, knees pulled to my chest, watching the tree lean, listening to every sound. The river ran on, unbothered, the trees swayed, and the occasional gust rattled the tent stakes, but nothing approached. By morning, the impression in the grass remained. The ground was dry, and no footprints led to or from the oval. My supplies, my fire pit, my carefully stacked wood, all untouched. It was as though a weight had pressed down and moved on without leaving a trace beyond that single flattened ring. I packed quickly, hands still trembling, and moved to the car with a vigilance I had never known. I left food, stove, and fishing gear behind, taking only what I could carry. I drove home slowly, replaying the night in my head, trying to find a rational explanation. A large animal, possibly a bear? But bears leave tracks, deep ones, claw marks, broken branches. Nothing had been disturbed except the grass, and the rhythm of the weight I had felt did not match the motion of a bear stepping. Human intervention seemed impossible. The distance from the trail made it unlikely anyone had been there without detection. The experience felt intimate and deliberate, like a presence measuring, testing, or observing, but without revealing itself. 2 weeks later, I read in the local news that a hiker had gone missing less than 5 miles from that bend in the river. The report described a familiar trail, partially obscured by early spring growth, a small campsite abandoned in a clearing. Search parties found no tracks leading from the campsite to the river, no sign of struggle, no torn clothing or gear. The hiker was simply gone, leaving the forest unchanged. The brush bent over lightly as if brushed aside by invisible hands. The details made my stomach turn. The same flattened grass, the same untraceable movement I had felt, had now coincided with a disappearance. I returned to the bend later that spring. During the day, curiosity gnawing at me despite the unease. The clearing looked normal in sunlight, the river ran clear and steady, and the forest appeared as it always had. Yet I could not shake the memory of that vibration, the silent pressure against my tent, and the perfect oval of pressed grass. The elk were still absent, the tracks in the mud minimal. I studied the grass, the soil, and the slight depressions around the clearing, but nothing could explain the night I had experienced. Nothing tangible could account for the sensation of being measured, observed, or touched without a sound or footprint. I learned then to trust subtle signals, the quiet warnings that the wilderness gives without speaking. It wasn't a matter of superstition, but of awareness, understanding that the forest holds patterns of movement beyond what is visible, and that absence of evidence does not equal safety. The bend in the river had always been a place of comfort, familiar and forgiving. But that night it became a reminder that even the places we know best can conceal the unexpected. The missing hiker confirmed it. I could not deny that the world sometimes moves around us, and we remain oblivious until the consequences surface. I have not returned alone since. I fish in different locations, further downstream, where the river curves more gently, where the forest opens enough to feel the presence of the sky. I carry extra gear now, not just for survival, but for observation, binoculars, stakes to mark positions, a notebook to record subtle signs of movement. That night at the bend remains vivid, a lesson in patience, caution, and respect. The grass, the vibration, the silence all taught me that in the forest, not every influence is visible, and some presences leave traces so delicate, so precise, that they can vanish before daylight, leaving only the impression of a weight that had been there and then gone. The memory remains sharp in my mind, a quiet warning every time I see a bend in a river, every time I step into grass that is taller than my knees, and every time I camp in a place I thought I knew,